When people think of the Mafia, they often picture men like Al Capone, Pablo Escobar, or Vito Genovese, loud, ruthless, and brash. Men who flaunted their power, demanded attention, and ultimately drew the spotlight that led to their downfall. But the most powerful Mafia boss in American history didn't shout. He whispered. He didn't flaunt his wealth in nightclubs or newspapers. He hid it behind modest homes and quiet dinners. He didn't chase the title of boss of bosses, but in silence, he became just that. His name was Carlo Gambino, and he would rule the underworld for 2 decades with cunning, patience, and an invisible iron fist. Carlo Gambino was unlike the mobsters who came before him. He didn't dress in flashy suits like Capone. He didn't draw attention with flamboyant parties like Frank Costello. He didn't terrify the public with explosions like Escobar. Instead, he mastered the art of disappearing in plain sight. To law enforcement, he looked like a quiet family man. To his neighbors, he was polite, low-key, even boring. Yet behind this mask of modesty was a man orchestrating an empire that stretched from New York to Las Vegas, from construction unions to international shipping. While others sought glory, Gambino sought longevity, and he achieved something almost no Mafia boss ever did. He died peacefully, in his own bed, at the age of 74. Carlo Gambino's nickname says it all: the Quiet Don. He rarely spoke in meetings. When he did, others listened. He didn't need to yell, because his silence carried weight. In an underworld ruled by fear and ego, Gambino's restraint was his greatest weapon. He allowed louder men like Albert Anastasia and Vito Genovese to burn brightly and collapse, while he quietly maneuvered behind the scenes, building alliances and waiting for the perfect moment to strike. That moment would come in 1957, when Anastasia was gunned down in a barbershop chair, a hit that Gambino quietly supported. From the ashes of his rivals, Gambino emerged as boss of one of New York's 5 families. Under his leadership, it would become the most powerful crime family in America. Make no mistake, Carlo Gambino was not soft. He was ruthless when he needed to be. He ordered murders. He betrayed rivals. He sanctioned hits that changed the shape of the Mafia. But unlike men such as Genovese, who ruled by open terror, Gambino used violence strategically. He understood that killing too many people created chaos. Instead, he wielded death like a scalpel, removing only those who stood directly in his way. To Gambino, power wasn't about fear. It was about control. And control required patience. Carlo Gambino's story matters because it challenges the way we think about power. In a world where mobsters became famous for being loud and brutal, Gambino proved that the most dangerous man in the room is often the quiet one. He showed that survival in the Mafia wasn't about making headlines, it was about avoiding them. While Capone rotted in prison, while Luciano was deported, while Genovese died behind bars, Gambino thrived. For 20 years, his family ran rackets worth billions. Politicians bowed to his influence. Union bosses worked at his command. Yet the average American barely knew his name. Here lies the irony. The most powerful Mafia boss of all time was also the least known. His empire grew so large that decades later, his name would live on in the Gambino crime family, one of the most notorious Mafia organizations in history. But during his lifetime, Carlo himself remained a ghost rarely photographed, rarely quoted, rarely seen. He perfected the art of ruling without exposing himself, and in doing so, he achieved what no one else could. He outlived his enemies and secured a legacy of power that still resonates today. This is not a story of fireworks or flamboyance. It is the story of subtlety, patience, and quiet dominance. Over the next chapters, we will uncover his childhood in Sicily and the immigrant journey that brought him to America, his early hustles in New York, where he rose through cunning rather than brute force, his alliance with Lucky Luciano and survival through prohibition, his climb under the Mangano brothers and Albert Anastasia, the barbershop murder that cleared his path to the throne, his reign as the quiet Don, where he controlled unions, businesses, and politics from the shadows. And finally, his peaceful death in 1976, a fate almost no mob boss was ever granted. In the Mafia, most men either burn out or get cut down. Carlo Gambino did neither. He mastered the art of silence, and in that silence, he ruled an empire. This is the story of the Don who didn't need to shout, the Don who never chased glory, the Don who built his power on patience and control. This is the story of Carlo Gambino, the quiet Don who ruled in silence. Every great story begins with humble origins. For Carlo Gambino, those origins lay in the rugged hills and ancient streets of Capone, a small town in Sicily, Italy. It was here, in 1902, that one of the future architects of the American Mafia was born, not into wealth or privilege, but into a culture where family honor, silence, and survival were everything. At the turn of the 20th century, Sicily was a land of contradictions. Its landscapes were breathtaking rolling hills, olive groves, and sunlit fields. But life for ordinary families was harsh. Poverty was widespread, opportunities were scarce, and the shadow of the Sicilian Mafia, known locally as Cosa Nostra, stretched across villages like Capone. Carlo was born into a modest family. His father worked the land, laboring in fields that barely yielded enough to feed the family. His mother kept the household together, raising children in an environment where loyalty and discipline were not optional. They were survival. For young Carlo, this world carved lessons into him early. Never show weakness, never trust outsiders, and above all, protect your family's honor at all costs. In Sicily, the Mafia was not just a criminal organization. It was part of the culture. It acted as an alternative power structure in towns where the government was weak, where peasants relied on Mafia protection more than distant politicians. Children like Carlo grew up hearing whispered stories of men who commanded respect not because of wealth, but because of fear. These men lived by a code of silence. Omertà. It was the belief that you never spoke of Mafia affairs to outsiders, not even to the police. For Carlo, these codes were not abstract. They were present in daily life. He watched men settle disputes without ever calling the law. He saw neighbors bow their heads when local Mafia figures passed by. And he understood, even as a boy, that real power came not from loud displays, but from quiet control. Unlike many of his peers, Carlo wasn't brash. He did not boast or pick unnecessary fights. He was small, thin, and unassuming. But those who knew him as a child noticed his eyes, calm, calculating, always observing. Carlo learned early how to listen more than he spoke. In a land where rash words could get a man killed, silence was strength. Where other boys fought openly, Carlo watched, studied, and remembered. It was a skill that would define his life. But discipline could not fill empty stomachs. Sicily in the early 1900s was marked by crushing poverty. Families worked the land but remained poor, exploited by wealthy landowners. Young men faced bleak futures unless they aligned with the Mafia or left Sicily entirely. By the time Carlo was a teenager, he was already dreaming of more. He didn't want to spend his life toiling under the Sicilian sun, bound to poverty. He wanted opportunity, and like millions of Italians at the time, he believed that opportunity lay across the Atlantic, in America. The Gambino family, like many Sicilians, had relatives who had already made the journey to New York. Letters would arrive describing crowded tenements, factory jobs, and hard work, but also the promise of wealth and freedom. To young Carlo, these letters were sparks of hope. He knew that in America, Italians faced discrimination and hardship. But he also knew that the Mafia had already planted roots in New York's immigrant neighborhoods. For someone like him, disciplined, ambitious, and quietly ruthless, America was not just a new world. It was an open field. In 1921, at the age of 19, Carlo Gambino left Sicily. He boarded a ship bound for New York, carrying little more than his family's hopes and the lessons Sicily had given him. It was not an easy farewell. Sicily was a land that clung to its children with deep roots of tradition and family ties. But Carlo understood that staying meant stagnation. Leaving meant opportunity. As the ship pulled away from the Italian coast, he stood on the deck, staring at the receding hills of his homeland. Behind him was the poverty and quiet codes of Capone. Ahead of him was America, a land of danger, promise, and power. Though he left Sicily physically, Carlo never left it spiritually. The lessons of his childhood remained etched in him for life. Silence is power. In Sicily, speaking too much could end lives. Carlo carried this with him always. Family is everything. Loyalty to blood and chosen allies mattered more than law or government. Patience wins. Sicily taught him that power comes to those who wait for the right moment. These lessons, learned as a boy in the hills of Capone, would guide him through the turbulent underworld of New York. They would allow him to outlast louder, more reckless men. They would transform him from an immigrant teenager into the most powerful mafia boss in America. Carlo Gambino's childhood in Sicily was not one of privilege or ease. It was one of poverty, discipline, and observation. Yet it forged in him the traits that would one day define his reign: restraint, cunning, and an ability to rule without drawing attention. In the quiet streets of Capone, the boy who would become the quiet Don learned the value of silence. And in the roaring streets of New York, he would one day wield that silence as his greatest weapon. In 1921, a 19-year-old Carlo Gambino stepped off a ship onto the docks of New York City. Like millions of Italian immigrants before him, he carried little more than the clothes on his back, a sharp mind, and the quiet lessons of Sicily. But unlike most who dreamed only of steady work and survival, Carlo carried a different ambition. He wanted opportunity, not in factories or construction, but in the shadows of organized crime. New York in the early 1920s was a city of extremes. The skyline rose with glittering skyscrapers, but the streets below were crowded with immigrant families packed into tenements. Italians were among the poorest, facing discrimination and hard labor. Carlo settled in Brooklyn, near relatives who had immigrated earlier. His neighborhood was rough, filled with push carts, street vendors, and children running barefoot through alleys. But beneath the surface, another world pulsed. The world of the Mafia. In the Italian communities, men whispered about protection rackets, gambling dens, and liquor shipments. These weren't just criminals. They were power brokers. And to Carlo, they represented a ladder out of poverty. Carlo quickly connected with the organization of Salvatore "Toto" D'Aquila, one of the most powerful mafia bosses in New York at the time. D'Aquila's men controlled rackets in Harlem and Brooklyn, and young Gambino's loyalty, discretion, and Sicilian background made him a useful recruit. At first, his work was small, running errands, delivering packages, acting as a lookout. But Gambino was observant. He watched how orders were given, how money flowed, how disputes were settled without ever calling the police. He learned when to speak and when to remain silent, usually the latter. In a world filled with loud young toughs, desperate to prove themselves, Carlo stood out for his calmness. He didn't boast. He didn't draw attention. He did his job with quiet efficiency, and in doing so, earned the respect of older men who recognized discipline when they saw it. Just months after Carlo arrived, the United States passed the 18th Amendment banning alcohol. What was meant as a moral crusade quickly became a criminal gold rush. Prohibition turned liquor into liquid gold, and the Mafia was among the first to seize the opportunity. D'Aquila's men, along with other Italian and Jewish gangs, smuggled whiskey from Canada, operated speakeasies in Manhattan, and paid off police to look the other way. For Carlo Gambino, this was a chance to prove himself. He worked long nights supervising shipments, collecting payments, and ensuring that every operation ran smoothly. Unlike some of his peers who pocketed money or drew unnecessary violence, Gambino kept a low profile. He cared less about fast cash and more about long-term trust. By the mid-1920s, Carlo had earned a reputation. He was known as a man who could be relied upon, who didn't gossip, who didn't betray, and who didn't hesitate when an order was given. Though small in stature, he barely stood 5'7" and weighed less than 150 pounds. Carlo carried an air of quiet authority. When he walked into a room, men noticed not his size, but his composure. One associate later recalled, "Carlo didn't need to raise his voice. You could feel the weight of his silence." That silence, that ability to blend in while quietly pulling strings, would become his signature. The 1920s were a bloody time for the Mafia. Rival gangs fought over territory, and New York's Italian underworld fractured into factions. D'Aquila himself was eventually assassinated in 1928 during the Mafia Wars. Many young recruits vanished during these years, swallowed by bullets in alleys or betrayals in back rooms. But Carlo survived. He survived not because he was the strongest or the loudest, but because he knew how to keep his head down. He avoided unnecessary fights, built quiet alliances, and made himself useful without ever drawing envy. It was during these years that Gambino also began building ties with men who would shape his future. Lucky Luciano and Frank Costello, rising stars who envisioned a more modern, businesslike mafia. Even as he climbed through the ranks, Carlo maintained the appearance of a modest family man. He married his cousin, Catherine Castellano, binding himself to the powerful Castellano family of Brooklyn. To neighbors, he was polite and unremarkable. He lived in a modest home, dressed simply, and avoided the flamboyant lifestyle of other mobsters. To the FBI agents who later tried to track him, Gambino often looked like just another Italian immigrant blending into the crowd. But behind closed doors, he was already shaping his empire. What separated Carlo from many of his peers was foresight. Even in his 20s, he thought long-term. He didn't waste energy on petty fights. He didn't spend nights drunk in speakeasies. Instead, he saved money, invested carefully, and built loyalty with men who would one day be his soldiers. He saw prohibition not as a wild gamble, but as the foundation of something larger, a chance to build lasting influence in unions, shipping, and construction. While others chased quick riches, Carlo built structures that would endure. Carlo Gambino's early years in America were not marked by fireworks or fame. They were marked by quiet, patient hustles. He arrived in New York as a teenager from Sicily, and within a decade, he had positioned himself as a trusted man within the Mafia. He was not yet a boss, not yet the quiet don who would one day rule an empire. But the traits that defined his reign, patience, discretion, and control, were already there. In the roaring streets of Prohibition-era New York, where men rose and fell overnight, Carlo Gambino was laying foundations. He was the man who survived, who adapted, and who quietly prepared for the day when he would rule. By the mid-1920s, the streets of New York had become a battlefield. Bootlegging was no longer a side hustle. It was the bloodstream of organized crime. Fortunes were made overnight, and rivalries were settled in blood. For many young mobsters, it was a race to grab as much as possible before the inevitable crash. But for Carlo Gambino, it was something else. It was an opportunity to play the long game. Carlo's entry into bootlegging came through the networks of Salvatore Maranzano and later the Mangiano brothers, whose family he would eventually join. Prohibition had turned liquor into a billion-dollar industry, and the Mafia was at the heart of it. Shipments came in from Canada and the Caribbean, unloaded under the cover of night, stored in warehouses, and sold to speakeasies across New York. Gambino was not the man running through alleys with a bottle under his coat. He was the man making sure the trucks ran on time, the drivers got paid, and the police looked the other way. While others bragged about their earnings, Gambino invested quietly, strengthening his influence in shipping and trucking. He saw early that control of transportation meant control of the racket itself. The late 1920s brought chaos to New York's underworld. A violent conflict erupted between two powerful bosses, Joe Masseria, known as Joe the Boss, and Salvatore Maranzano. This war, known as the Castellammarese War, tore through the Mafia, leaving bodies in the streets and alliances in shambles. For many, it was a time of reckless bloodshed. For Carlo Gambino, it was a time of careful positioning. He aligned himself with Lucky Luciano, a rising figure who had grown tired of the old Sicilian ways and dreamed of a modern, business-like mafia. Luciano's vision was bold: end the war, eliminate the old bosses, and create a new structure where power was shared through a council. What would later be known as the Commission. Carlo saw wisdom in this plan. Instead of chaos, Luciano promised order. Instead of endless vendettas, he promised profit. And so Gambino, with his trademark discretion, quietly pledged his loyalty. In 1931, Joe Masseria was murdered while dining at a Coney Island restaurant. Luciano had betrayed his old boss, arranging the hit that would end the Castellammarese War. Shortly after, Luciano turned on Maranzano as well, ordering his assassination before Maranzano could kill him first. The old world of mafia leadership based on brute force and rigid Sicilian tradition was gone. In its place, Luciano built something new: the Commission, a governing body made up of New York's 5 families and their allies. Carlo Gambino was not yet a household name, not yet a boss, but he had chosen wisely. By aligning with Luciano, he positioned himself on the winning side of history. After the war, Gambino officially became a member of the Mangano crime family, one of the 5 families established under the Commission. The Mangano brothers, Vincent and Philip, controlled Brooklyn's docks and shipping industries, a natural fit for Gambino, who already had a foothold in trucking. Here, Carlo thrived. He managed labor rackets, manipulated unions, and ensured that goods moving in and out of New York's harbors paid tribute to the Mafia. Dock workers who resisted soon learned that accidents happened. Ships sank, trucks burned, men disappeared. But unlike flashier mobsters who intimidated with open violence, Gambino worked quietly. He preferred bribes to bullets, deals to showdowns. His power grew not from fear alone, but from respect for his reliability. During this period, Gambino deepened his ties with Luciano, Meyer Lansky, and Frank Costello, men who shared his vision of the Mafia as a business empire rather than a street gang. He also forged relationships within the Mangano family, biding his time under the leadership of Albert Anastasia, a brutal enforcer who would later become boss. Carlo saw in Anastasia both strength and weakness. Anastasia was feared, but his temper made him reckless. Carlo understood that patience would one day give him an opening. If Sicily had taught Carlo the value of silence, Luciano taught him the value of structure. The Mafia could not survive as a collection of feuding clans. It needed rules, boundaries, and a council to prevent destructive wars. Gambino absorbed these lessons eagerly. He knew that his future depended not just on surviving the next battle, but on securing a system where order ruled over chaos. He also learned that power was best wielded quietly. Luciano, though bold, never boasted in public. He let others chase headlines, while he quietly pulled strings. It was a model Gambino would perfect even further. By the early 1930s, Carlo Gambino was no longer a low-level immigrant hustler. He was a trusted member of the Mangano family, connected to Luciano's new commission, and quietly building wealth through shipping, trucking, and bootlegging. He had survived Prohibition, survived the Castellammarese War, and aligned himself with the winning side. Now, as the Mafia transitioned into a new era of structure and profit, Gambino stood ready to climb higher. Carlo Gambino's rise during Prohibition was not loud or dramatic. He did not lead armies of killers, nor did he make himself the face of the Mafia. Instead, he positioned himself with precision, choosing the right allies, the right battles, and the right opportunities. In a time when mobsters lived and died by the gun, Gambino thrived by patience. He understood that the future of the Mafia was not in chaos, but in organization, not in headlines, but in shadows. And as Lucky Luciano built his commission, Carlo Gambino quietly built his foundation, one that would one day make him the most powerful Mafia boss in America. By the 1930s and 40s, Carlo Gambino had firmly established himself in the Mangano crime family, one of the 5 families that now dominated New York's underworld. He was still not a boss, not even the most visible figure within the organization. But as always, Gambino's strength lay not in what people saw, but in what they didn't. He was building power quietly, waiting patiently for the right moment to step out of the shadows. The Mangano brothers, Vincent and Philip, ran their family with an iron grip. Their power base was the Brooklyn waterfront, where labor unions and longshoremen were under their control. To move cargo in and out of New York Harbor meant paying tribute to the Mangano family. For decades, the docks were a gold mine. Shipments of food, clothing, liquor, and raw materials all passed through. Gambino, who had been involved in trucking and shipping rackets since his earliest days in America, fit naturally into this empire. He became an important figure on the waterfront, quietly skimming money from unions and securing a network of loyal soldiers. But Gambino's role was not just about money. He was a patient observer. While the Mangano brothers publicly ran the family, Gambino stayed close, absorbing how they operated, learning their weaknesses, and identifying opportunities. He had already proven that survival mattered more than glory. While other mobsters burned out in wars or wasted fortunes in nightclubs, Carlo stayed steady. He invested his money, kept his profile low, and strengthened ties not just inside the Mangano family, but across the Mafia world. Most importantly, he forged a quiet alliance with Albert Anastasia, the family's most feared enforcer. Albert Anastasia was everything Gambino was not. Known as the Lord High Executioner, Anastasia was violent, unpredictable, and utterly ruthless. He rose to power as one of the leaders of Murder, Inc., the enforcement arm of the Mafia that carried out hundreds of contract killings across the country. Anastasia commanded fear wherever he went. Judges, policemen, and even fellow mobsters trembled at his name. When the Mangano brothers clashed with him over control of the family, it was only a matter of time before blood would spill. Gambino, ever cautious, kept close to Anastasia. He understood that while Anastasia's brutality made him dangerous, it also made him vulnerable. If Gambino could stand at his side, he could both protect himself and quietly prepare for the day when Anastasia's recklessness would lead to disaster. In 1951, everything changed. Vincent Mangano, the boss of the family, vanished without a trace. His brother Philip was found dead in a marsh near Sheepshead Bay, shot through the head. Everyone in the underworld knew who was behind it: Albert Anastasia. The murders shocked the Mafia. It was a brazen move, even by mob standards. But no one challenged Anastasia directly. With the Mangano brothers gone, Anastasia assumed leadership of the family. He named Carlo Gambino as his underboss. For Gambino, it was a masterstroke. He had not lifted a finger in the Mangano murders, yet he benefited from the outcome. He was now second in command of one of the most powerful Mafia families in New York. As underboss, Gambino continued to display his trademark patience. He never tried to outshine Anastasia, never competed for attention. Instead, he let Anastasia dominate the spotlight with his fiery temper and violent methods. Meanwhile, Gambino quietly expanded his influence. He tightened control of the Brooklyn docks, secured deeper relationships with unions, and managed finances with precision. He also built stronger alliances with outside figures, including Genovese family leaders and Luciano loyalists, ensuring that if trouble came, he would not stand alone. And trouble did come. Anastasia's brutality, once a source of fear and power, became a liability. He ordered killings recklessly, often against the wishes of the commission. He terrified not only enemies, but also allies. Judges, prosecutors, and the press began focusing more heavily on the Mafia, in large part because of Anastasia's violent reputation. Gambino, by contrast, remained invisible. To the public, he was barely known. To the FBI, he was just another name in the Mafia. But within the underworld, whispers grew louder. Anastasia was too reckless, too dangerous, too unstable to remain boss forever. And if Anastasia fell, there was only one man positioned perfectly to take his place: Carlo Gambino. For years, Gambino had played the long game. He had aligned himself with Luciano when it mattered, survived the chaos of the Castellammarese War, and avoided the mistakes that had destroyed so many others. Now, with Anastasia ruling recklessly, Gambino needed only to wait. His time was coming, and when it did, he would not need bullets to claim power. He would need patience, alliances, and the quiet hand of fate. The story of the Mangano brothers and the rise of Anastasia marked a turning point in Carlo Gambino's life. It was here that he learned the final piece of his strategy, that sometimes the best way to gain power is to let others destroy themselves. By aligning with Anastasia, Gambino became underboss. By staying patient, he positioned himself as the natural successor. And by keeping his hands clean while others spilled blood, he ensured that when the time came, he could step into power with little resistance. The quiet Don was not yet the boss, but the stage was set. The Mangano brothers were gone. Anastasia reigned with chaos, and Carlo Gambino, calm as ever, waited in the shadows, ready to inherit an empire. By the mid-1950s, Albert Anastasia sat atop the Mangano family as boss, with Carlo Gambino as his underboss. Anastasia was feared across the underworld, a man whose name was synonymous with violence. To the press, he was the Mad Hatter. To his enemies, he was the Lord High Executioner. He had earned his reputation leading Murder Inc., the enforcement arm of the Mafia, responsible for hundreds of killings. But power built on fear is fragile. Anastasia's temper, paranoia, and reckless decisions were alienating both allies and rivals. And in the shadows, Carlo Gambino was watching silent, patient, waiting. Anastasia's problems began with his unpredictability. He sanctioned killings without consulting the Commission, the governing council of the Mafia. In one infamous case, he ordered the murder of a Brooklyn tailor simply because he suspected the man of disrespect. These rash decisions infuriated other bosses. Meanwhile, law enforcement pressure was mounting. Newspapers wrote lurid headlines about his brutality. Prosecutors sought to make examples of him. And for the Commission, which had tried to modernize the Mafia into a corporate-style empire, Anastasia was a liability. Carlo Gambino understood this better than anyone. He remained loyal publicly, never challenging Anastasia directly. But quietly, he built alliances with others who shared his view that Anastasia's reign had to end. The key ally was Vito Genovese, boss of the Genovese crime family. Genovese had long despised Anastasia and wanted him removed. He saw in Gambino the perfect partner, discreet, ambitious, and patient. Together, they began to plan. But Gambino was careful. He knew that moving against Anastasia carried immense risk. Anastasia was feared, and any misstep could mean retaliation. So Gambino waited for the perfect opportunity, ensuring the Commission would not oppose the move. By 1957, that opportunity arrived. Genovese consolidated support from other bosses, convincing them that Anastasia's recklessness endangered them all. Quietly, Gambino agreed to provide the final push. On October 25, 1957, Albert Anastasia walked into the Park Sheraton Hotel in Midtown Manhattan. It was a routine morning. He entered the barbershop, took off his jacket, and reclined in the chair for a shave. What he didn't know was that his death had already been sealed. Two masked gunmen burst into the barbershop. Before Anastasia could react, bullets filled the room. He tried to rise, lunging toward what he thought was an attacker. But in his confusion, he attacked the reflection in the mirror. Moments later, he collapsed to the floor, riddled with bullets, dead at the age of 55. The murder shocked New York. Newspapers splashed it across front pages. To the public, it was another bloody mafia killing. To those in the underworld, it was a seismic shift. The Lord High Executioner was gone. Carlo Gambino's name never appeared in police reports. He wasn't seen near the barber shop. He wasn't linked to the gunman. Officially, no one knew who ordered the hit. But everyone in the Mafia understood the truth. Anastasia had enemies, yes, but Gambino had motive, opportunity, and the most to gain. With Anastasia gone, Gambino was the natural successor. And unlike Anastasia, Gambino had support. The commission approved. The Genovese family backed him. Even rivals recognized that Gambino's calm, business-like style would stabilize the family after years of chaos. In the days after Anastasia's murder, Gambino moved quietly but decisively. He consolidated his power, taking control of the Mangano family and renaming it the Gambino family, a name that would become infamous in American history. He placed loyal men in key positions, rewarded allies, and tightened control over the Brooklyn waterfront. At the same time, he avoided the flamboyance that had doomed Anastasia. No headlines, no open displays of wealth, just quiet, steady rule. Carlo Gambino's rise was not built on brute force. It was built on strategy. Where Anastasia ruled by fear, Gambino ruled by patience. Where Anastasia acted rashly, Gambino calculated. Where Anastasia burned bridges, Gambino built alliances. The assassination of Anastasia symbolized the triumph of Gambino's style of leadership: quiet, strategic, and invisible. He had achieved what so many mobsters dreamed of, not by shouting, but by whispering. Weeks later, the commission formally recognized Carlo Gambino as boss. For the first time, the family carried his name. He now led one of the 5 families of New York, with influence stretching across unions, gambling, construction, and shipping. But Gambino wasn't content with just being another boss. He had bigger ambitions. Over the next 2 decades, he would maneuver to become the most powerful mafia leader in America, the unofficial boss of bosses. The assassination of Albert Anastasia marked a turning point in mafia history. It was one of the most dramatic hits ever carried out, a bloody barbershop killing that became legend. But more importantly, it was the moment when Carlo Gambino stepped out of the shadows. For years, he had been the quiet man at Anastasia's side, underestimated and overlooked. Now, with his rival gone, he was the Don. And in the decades to come, he would prove that silence, patience, and strategy could build an empire more enduring than violence ever could. Carlo Gambino was no longer the quiet underboss. He was the quiet Don. When Albert Anastasia's body hit the floor of the Park Sheraton barbershop in 1957, the era of chaos in the Mangano family ended, and the era of Carlo Gambino began. From that moment, the quiet Don ruled with a style unlike any other boss in mafia history. Gambino inherited a family in turmoil. Anastasia had left behind fear, enemies, and law enforcement heat. But instead of responding with blood and fire, Gambino responded with calm and calculation. He reorganized the family quietly, placing trusted allies in key positions, rewarding loyalty, and ensuring that no one man could become too powerful. He understood something most mob bosses never did. The more you seek attention, the shorter your reign. Gambino never flaunted his power. He lived in a modest house in Brooklyn, wore conservative suits, and rarely allowed his photograph to be taken. To outsiders, he looked like any other middle-aged Italian immigrant, a man who kept to himself. But behind that unassuming image, he controlled an empire. Under Gambino's leadership, the family flourished. He tightened his grip on the Brooklyn waterfront, where unions bowed to his influence. He expanded into trucking, construction, and garment industries, using labor rackets to secure billions in contracts. He also saw the value in gambling and casinos, especially in Havana and later in Las Vegas. Through careful partnerships with other bosses, Gambino ensured that his family received a steady stream of income without drawing unnecessary attention. Where Anastasia had relied on brute force, Gambino relied on strategy. He preferred bribes over bullets, deals over wars. Violence, in his view, was a last resort, not the first tool out of the box. By the 1960s, Gambino's influence reached far beyond his own family. Through careful alliances, he became the most powerful figure on the commission. When disputes arose between families, his voice carried the most weight. When wars threatened, he brokered peace. He was never officially crowned boss of bosses. The commission, by design, rejected such a title. But in practice, Carlo Gambino was exactly that. His decisions shaped the Mafia, not only in New York, but across the country. Law enforcement knew who he was. The FBI watched his every move, tapped phones, followed his cars. But they found little. Gambino rarely spoke on phones, rarely appeared in public meetings, and never left a paper trail. To agents frustrated by his elusiveness, he was a ghost. One FBI report described him as a man who avoids the spotlight like a plague. Unlike flashier bosses such as John Gotti decades later, Gambino understood that survival meant invisibility. Time and again, prosecutors tried to build cases against him. Time and again, those cases fell apart. Witnesses disappeared, jurors were bribed, evidence mysteriously evaporated. Gambino remained untouchable. Carlo Gambino also understood the importance of family, not just his Mafia family, but his blood relatives. He arranged strategic marriages and alliances that tied his power to other influential clans. His marriage to Catherine Castellano had already bound him to the Castellano family. Later, he positioned his nephew, Paul Castellano, to succeed him. Through these moves, Gambino ensured that his empire would remain in the hands of those loyal to him. Perhaps the most remarkable part of Gambino's reign was not just how he lived, but how he died. While Capone rotted in prison, Luciano was deported, and Genovese died behind bars, Carlo Gambino outlasted them all. On October 15, 1976, after nearly 2 decades as boss, Carlo Gambino died peacefully of a heart attack at his home in Massapequa, Long Island. He was 74 years old. There were no gunshots, no raids, no bloody showdowns. He died in his bed, surrounded by family. For a Mafia boss, it was the rarest ending of all. Carlo Gambino's legacy is one of paradox. He was ruthless when needed, yet cautious to a fault. He ordered murders, yet avoided unnecessary bloodshed. He was the most powerful man in the American underworld, yet the least known to the public. His reign left behind the Gambino crime family, which became one of the most notorious Mafia organizations in history. Under his successors, the family would continue to dominate rackets, though many would lack the subtlety that defined Carlo's leadership. What set Gambino apart was not just what he achieved, but how he achieved it. He showed that in a world of loud, violent men, the one who whispers can rule them all. Carlo Gambino's story offers lessons that extend beyond organized crime. Patience outlasts aggression. While others fought for quick power, Gambino waited and built slowly. Silence is strength. By avoiding headlines, he avoided downfall. Strategy beats violence. Where bullets failed, deals succeeded. His death in bed, rather than in a hail of bullets, was proof that restraint could achieve what violence never could: longevity. Carlo Gambino ruled for nearly 20 years without ever being toppled. He was never dragged from a courthouse in handcuffs for a life sentence. He never fled into exile. He never fell victim to a bloody vendetta. Instead, he slipped away quietly, leaving behind an empire that bore his name. In the annals of Mafia history, men like Capone and Escobar are remembered for their noise. Carlo Gambino is remembered for his silence. And in that silence, he ruled longer, more effectively, and more completely than almost any Mafia boss in history. He was, and will forever be known as, the Quiet Dawn.